Howdy doody there. I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of psychology. We've already talked about it a little bit. I want to run over some of this um, quickly and point out some perspectives and introduce you to those perspectives. And if I have time, without getting too long winded, I want to introduce you to stress. That'll be the first topic, uh, probably in psychology for you, that takes you out of your comfort zone of thinking in terms of what psychology is, because most people have a misconception of psychology being nothing more than psychotherapy and psychoanalysis and schizophrenia and so on and so forth. There's a whole lot more to this ball game, so we'll get to it. If not today, later in the week, before the end of the week. So let's get started. The history of modern day psychology. Who's the father of modern day psychology? Wilhelm Wundt. Wilhelm. That's his first name. Last name is Wundt. If you want to pretend you're German, you could say Wilhelm Wundt. But Wilhelm Wundt, that's the American pronunciation. Who was that guy? Well, psychology up to this fellow's uh, involvement was basically a toy. It was not taken seriously. Why study thought? That although some people were very, very interested in the study of thought, most people could care less. They thought it was silliness because philosophy was the big thing. Philosophy and some medicine, um, physiology, some of these hard sciences, so to speak, math, but psychology, the study of conscious thought, give me a break, until Brother Wundt came on the scene, Dr. Wundt, medical doctor, also a professor at the University of Leipzig in Leipzig, Germany. He wanted to study conscious thought. He thought it was legitimate. So he introduced this method that he called introspection. That's not the same as introspective. Introspective is where you're thinking about something that you've encountered, or you're just philosophizing about things. Introspection was a monitoring mechanism, an introduction of a stimulus and then an examination of the response to that stimulus. That's what Wundt did, and he would time it, and he would basically draw from that what he called basic sensations and feelings from immediate reactions. And the thing that was important here was that it was an attempt to examine conscious thought. I keep making that point. It's important for you to get that. Conscious thought. Nothing else at the moment. So I'm going to say something to you. I want you to give me your immediate response, and then I'm going to examine that. I'm going to examine it from the standpoint of what were the basic sensations that I recognize, and I'll even ask you what were your immediate sensations related to what I just said, or what I showed you, or whatever I did. What were your feelings? What was the emotion that was evoked? That's what introspection was, and it caught on. It was scientifically accepted. So psychology went from this kind of a silly pursuit. Some people were even ridiculed for thinking about psychology. It went from that into becoming an accepted science. And this was in the 1700s, late 1700s. So it's a long time ago. Wundt, Wilhelm Wundt, he is the father of modern day psychology. He used the scientific method he had learned as a medical doctor. Now, the next character on our list, that fellow's name is Edward Titchener. Edward Titchener, let me run across this real quick. You can be a student of someone, not ever meet them, not ever sit in their classroom. when we say a student of, sometimes we're talking about a person's methods that you adopt as your own. So in this case, Edward Titchener, an Englishman, was a student of Wundt, meaning that he accepted Wundt's studies. He accepted introspection as a method to study conscious thought. But something happened with Titchener. First of all, Titchener came to the USA and camped out at Cornell University as a professor, a psychologist. You could call yourself a psychologist back in those days without a license, as if you were deeply involved in the study of psychology at the 1790s plus era, then okay, you're a psychologist. It wasn't any question. But why do I say that? Because that means you can study this and you became an authority in the day, an authority. So, Titchener, Englishman, 1867 to 1927, you can see how this moves rather quickly, was a professor at Cornell who initially was enthralled with introspection, but became a little disillusioned with it. His thinking turned to the structure of thought. What's the structure of mental life? Not what brain structures, but thinking itself. What's it made of? What are the elements? So he eventually dismissed introspection as silliness. I don't know whether he became an enemy of Wundt, but there's some discussion as to their dislike for one another, so to speak, because of Titchener's tossing off of introspection. So he became very involved in structuralism. He moved from introspection, Wundt, to structuralism, his little toy. The structure of mental life. What elements are involved, what structures are involved in you forming a thought? What are the pieces of that thought? The combined elements to form the experience of thought. That's what Titchener's, that was the important part of his thinking. I had a thought while I was saying that. Here's that thought. In order for Wundt to do his work, he had to establish a lab. So he established the first lab of psychology in Leipzig, Germany. Edward Titchener contributed to psychology to the point where he also needed a lab. So he established the first lab in America at Cornell University for the study of psychology. These two guys were very big time, heavy hitters. Led to the next fellow, whose name is William James. This guy was around a while, 1842 to 1910. He was at Harvard. I think he was a medical doctor, but that's not important. He was an American psychologist and philosopher. So he was, again, these self-named, I'm a psychologist because I study psychology. And again, bear in mind, excuse me, didn't mean to move my computer. Bear in mind, we're talking about conscious thought here. The formation and the implementation of structures to form conscious thinking. Now, again, James was a student of Wundt because all these people were buying into this introspection stuff. But then they went out on their own. So here's William James, Harvard professor, who was a proponent of the studies of Charles Darwin. If you remember Charles Darwin, this is the guy who introduced us to evolution, survival of the fittest, and something that people, for some reason, don't remember, and that's the word adaptation, because everything that Darwin studied is based on adaptation. So, William James, being a student of Wundt, could also really be called a student of Darwin in a sense. What does that matter? Well, it matters this way. He began to become disillusioned, as Tishner had with introspection. And he wasn't too interested in structure. What he was interested in was things like emotion and function. What was the function of emotion based on Darwinian theory? Now, how did he do that? He did it through this word called adaptation. That word gets left behind. I don't know why. So James is running around going, hey, if your body adapts to the environment and we become something that started out as one cell, whatever, and we become this human being, why not your brain? Why not thinking? Again, conscious thought, including emotion. So he's more interested in this function of thought, this function of emotion, this adaptation of thinking to the demands made on you. He wrote a textbook, the first textbook for psychology, written by James, 1,400 pages. Go read that, joker, if you could ever find a copy. Can you imagine lugging that thing around to class? It was called The Principles of Psychology. Now, that's the first textbook. Wundt wrote a book called The Physiological Principles of Psychology. Don't worry about that one. That was really the first, it wasn't a textbook, it was just the first book. Recognized anyway, but Principles of Psychology, the first textbook at Harvard. So here we have Wundt with introspection, Titchener with structuralism, and now we have William James with functionalism, the function of emotion related to adaptation that then affects your conscious thought. Now, we are at conscious thought, and lo and behold, here comes a fellow named Sigmund Freud. What's this guy all about? Well, Sigmund Freud wasn't a student of anybody. Sigmund Freud was a psychologist. By this time, you now had to have some recognized education and some credentials in terms of being a psychologist, particularly if you're practicing this stuff. Not many people up to this point were actually practicing anything. Wundt, Titchener, James were not, you didn't go to them for psychoanalysis. You didn't go to them to be examined. You went to them for experimental purposes. Matter of fact, they probably recruited students. Don't have any way of knowing it, but it would be kind of an obvious thing given the fact that they were in universities, all three of these fellows. Wundt at Leipzig, Titchener at Cornell, and James at Harvard. And then along comes this fellow, and you've heard of this guy, Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, you've heard of him. If you have, potentially you have misinformation about this guy. The uninformed think he was some sort of a sexual pervert. That's ridiculous. What he did was included sexual undertones in a lot of people's thinking. Now, we'll get to that later in the semester if we have time. But what I wanted to introduce you to here is a movement away from conscious thought into a study of the unconscious. Very, very controversial area. Does it even exist? Some say no. Many say no. Sigmund Freud is the first theorist. The people I've described to you so far were not theorists. They were ground layers, if you want to call them that. They laid foundations for the study of psychology, and they involved themselves in the areas I've described to you. Sigmund Freud developed a theory. Sigmund Freud's theory is called psychodynamic psychoanalytic theory. He's the father of psychoanalysis. What in the world is psychoanalysis? You come to my office, I'm going to have you lie down on this comfortable sofa. I'm going to sit in a chair with a pencil and a pad, and I'm going to ask you questions. You're 32 years old or you're 26 years old or whatever the case is, doesn't matter. I'm going to ask you stuff about your childhood. It's called talk therapy. I ask questions, you answer the questions. What he was trying to determine was if there was a conflict. Conflict of what? A conflict of my behaviors, my attitudes, my personality related to what I think is acceptable and what I deem unacceptable in terms of behavior. But the challenge was that I am not aware of this unacceptable stuff. That's hidden in my unconscious. So my job as a Freudian psychoanalyst is to bring forth that hidden stuff out of your unconscious and table it, and let's look at this stuff. This is what's causing your problem. Um, Today, we don't do that because this has been found to be a little bit unacceptable because basically it doesn't really work. But in the day, it was thought that it did. So, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalytic theory I just described to you. What's the psychodynamic part? That's your personality. So, I'm looking at you trying to determine the effects on you that create your personality, and I'm looking for conflicts hidden within you that are causing you problems because you know what acceptable behaviors are, but you're driven to do unacceptable things. That's a tip of the iceberg in a nutshell kind of a deal with Sigmund Freud. The biggie here is he brought forth unconscious stuff that affects conscious thinking. And we could go on and on, but we'll leave Freud for the moment. We'll get into other things about Freud if we have time in some of these lectures. I want to introduce you to some perspectives, and I'm going to fly through these because we're starting to get this thing to be too long here. So, all right, we're leaving behind these first four fellows, and we're going to talk briefly about three guys: John B. Watson, Ivan Pavlov, and B.F. Skinner. And they're involved in a perspective. This is not a theory, although it's based on theory. And it's called the behavioral perspective. The behavioral perspective means that it's a study of what it says. It's what your behavioral components are based on stimuli in your responses to stimuli, various stimuli. I can't nor will I go into a deep discussion of this because it's in your textbook and it's part of your reading. But keep in mind that there's some behavioral, deep behavioral studies that are ongoing, have been since Freud, since the beginning of the study of psychology. And these guys kind of narrowed it down. This becomes a part of learning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, those kind of things. And those are very deeply discussed in your textbook. So look for these. Ivan Pavlov is the guy that you may or may not have heard of, this fellow that studied this the way dogs slobber. That's Ivan Pavlov, but that's not what he did. Something related to that. B.F. Skinner studied responses, behavioral responses, as did John B. Watson. Watson was a brilliant psychologist, started his career at the School of Psychology in Chicago, wound up Johns Hopkins, became world renowned, and then he blew it. But I won't go into all that. Okay, that's the behavioral perspective, the study of behaviors, where do they come from, etc. The next bunch on the list, uh, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, the humanistic perspective. Humanism. What is this all about? Talking about you having free will. You can make voluntary choices of behaviors. Carl Rogers controversial. He says that every human being that comes out of the womb is this wonderful, positive little bundle of joy. Well, let me tell you something. I taught kindergarten when I first started teaching, and I didn't have too many bundles of joy. It was more like miniature WWE because it's very competitive and they're very selfish, most of them. They want something and they claim it as their own, and so that's why I don't have any hair anymore. I taught kindergarten. Free will, self-actualization. That's an Abraham Maslow thing. What does that mean? Reaching your full potential, basically. From out of that, we get positive psychology. You can read about positive psychology. That's a brief discussion of the humanistic perspective. The cognitive perspective. There are no names associated with this per se. What does this deal with? Cognitive is another way of saying thinking. So cognitive perspective deals with thinking. It also deals with perception, your interpretation of things. And then information processing. What is information processing? That's how you manage memory. That's how you create mental images. That's where impressions of your experiences lives. Uh, all these things, these concepts that you've created based on how you interpret things. So cognitive perspectives. You will be reading about neuroscience and biopsychology, and you will also be reading about evolutionary perspectives. And then sociocultural perspective. Another perspective. No names again really associated with this. This is a study of culture. I teach cross-cultural psychology. You may look into taking that. Very interesting course. We're talking about sociocultural perspective is social interactions, cultural determinants. In other words, what's your culture tell you in terms of your behaviors in any given situation? It involves ethnicity, a question about what is race, what is ethnicity. Race is biological, ethnicity is cultural. Religion, what's your occupation, what socioeconomic class are you in. Social culture also studies behavior, mental processes, these things I can't observe. I can see the behaviors that come from that. And then a word called ethnocentricity. It's a nasty word. It means judgmental. I view a culture that's different from me as inferior. That's ethnocentricity. They're no more inferior than anybody else. They just do things different from what I do. And I do things different from what they do. So a very big consideration develops into a bias. And then last on our list is called biopsychosocial. This is the newest, one of the newest perspectives, and this deals with the combination of everything that I've talked to you about. Um, Biology, psychology, sociology. All of these things roll into one in terms of how these things affect you. Who are you? What are you? Uh, what are your thoughts, emotions, etc.? So this is the biopsychosocial perspective. There are other perspectives. These are the biggies. These are the main ones, and there's new ones being developed all the time. So I hope you got something out of this. That was a little long-winded. I'm not going to get to stress in this lecture. I'll do that tomorrow or Friday, just to get you in the loop. I want you to have a good understanding of stress, and I shall see you soon.